He escaped a Nazi death camp in 1945, and then vanished, no grave, no records, no trace. For decades, history forgot his name. But in 2023, an old suitcase is found in a crumbling attic. Inside, a journal, a map, a photograph, and a secret so haunting, it threatens to rewrite everything we thought we knew about the end of the war and the man who chose silence over freedom. Before we turn another page in a story history tried to erase, before we follow the ghost of a man who survived the unthinkable only to vanish into silence, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support lets us keep searching through dust and shadows, piecing together the lives that slipped through time's fingers. Every subscription is more than a click. It's a promise that the forgotten will not remain unseen. What you do here keeps the light burning in the archives of memory. Thank you for listening when the world once chose silence. The suitcase was coated in decades of dust, its leather cracked like old skin, hinges rusted shut by time. It was found by accident contractors preparing to demolish a long-abandoned farmhouse near the border of Alsace, France. A place forgotten by maps and memory. The attic had sagged in the middle, light slicing in through broken slats like interrogation beams. No one had set foot up there in years. When the box was finally pried open, the air shifted. Not with the smell of mildew or age, but with the weight of something unresolved. Something waiting. Inside, beneath layers of decaying linen and yellowed newsprint, were a handful of objects so ordinary they might have gone unnoticed. A faded photograph of a young man in uniform, eyes tired but proud. Scraps of correspondence written in looping, uneven script. And a leather-bound journal, its cover scorched along the edges, as if someone had once tried to destroy it and then changed their mind. Its pages were brittle and brown, filled with entries in broken German and occasional Yiddish phrases, scrawled diagonally in the margins. There were sketches too, barbed wire, a gate, a figure hunched over in the snow, and a single name inscribed on the inner flap in faint pencil. Emil Weiss. The name wasn't familiar, not to the archivists, not to the Holocaust historians consulted later, not to the long and labyrinthine databases of those who had died or those who had survived. It wasn't just that the name had been forgotten, it had been absent, as if this man had slipped through history like water through fractured stone. But Emil Weiss had existed. There were breadcrumbs, if you knew where to look. A transport list from the Theresienstadt dated late 1944. A reference to an E. Weiss, penciled beside a prisoner manifest in Buchenwald, later crossed out. No death date, no liberation date, just a single mark, then silence. It was 70 years later when the journal was found. 70 years of nothing. And suddenly, too much. What troubled investigators wasn't only that Emil had escaped a Nazi camp. It was that after surviving the most brutal machinery of death the 20th century had created, he vanished again. Not as a refugee, not as a citizen reborn, but as a ghost. No passport applications, no hospital records, no family claims. He wasn't on any list of displaced persons. He didn't reappear in Israel, or the Americas, or post-war Europe. He simply disappeared. And yet, here was his voice, in brittle ink and fragmented memory. The snow fell like ash today, one entry read. I buried my name beneath it. The pages dripped with melancholy, with the mind of someone unmoored from time. Emil did not write to remember, he wrote to forget. But in doing so, he left a trail he never intended anyone to follow. Who was he running from, after the war had ended? Why did he hide in plain sight, leaving behind no trace but this forgotten suitcase in a crumbling attic? What secret was so powerful it demanded a second disappearance? In the years that followed, many would attempt to answer these questions. Some would claim he was a deserter, others, a vigilante. But all would agree on one thing. Emil Weiss escaped death twice, and twice, he vanished. There were no clocks in the camp, but time still passed slowly, cruelly. Measured not by hours or days, but by the distance between meals, the length of a beating, the duration of a stare from the wrong guard. Emil Weiss had stopped counting the days after the 50th. Or maybe it was the 100th. They all blurred into one long, gray moment, punctuated only by the shriek of a whistle or the bark of a command. He remembered little with clarity. Only fragments. The way snowflakes melted on his cheeks before he could feel them, the sound of boots crunching behind him, the way hope could be a dangerous, violent thing. Theresienstadt had been deception. Buchenwald was truth. There were no orchestras here, no staged Red Cross inspections. Just mud and fire and silence. Emil had arrived with eyes that still searched for reason. Within weeks, he stopped looking. It was easier not to see. Easier to let the frost bite into his fingers without protest. To sleep with one eye open and never dream. To carry bricks from one side of the yard to the other, then back again, knowing it meant nothing. That was the point. They weren't building anything. The hunger was constant. It made men forget their names, forget their families, forget mercy. Emil watched it eat through their humanity like rust on metal. Friends became strangers. Strangers became thieves. And sometimes, murderers. He learned to stay quiet, to make himself small. To give up the idea that survival was noble. It was not. It was animal. It was selfish. And yet, there was still a voice inside him, quiet but steady, that said, "Not yet." Escape was a word whispered only at night, under the breath, when frost clung to the roof beams and guards dozed off drunk. Most didn't believe it was possible. And those who did? They rarely lasted long. The camp punished hope quickly and publicly. Bodies strung along fences like warnings, their eyes frozen open. Emil had seen enough to know better. He had no plan. He only had a moment. And when it came with the rain. It was March 1945. The sky cracked open in the early hours, rain pouring down like morning. The guards were distracted, gunfire echoed from the hills. American artillery, maybe. Or another skirmish between ghosts. No one cared anymore who was winning. Only that it might end soon. That night, the lights faltered. For a single breathless minute, the Eastern Guard Tower went dark. Emil didn't move, not at first. But something inside him did. He left the barracks barefoot, breath held like a dying prayer. Mud swallowed his steps. He moved past 2 rows of sleeping bodies, then a third. Every shadow was a trap. Every sound, a scream waiting to happen. He reached the fence, a tangle of rusted metal and old blood, and saw it. A break, barely wide enough to squeeze through. No one else had dared. But Emil was not anyone else. He was already a ghost. Only now he would choose where he haunted. The wire sliced into his arms as he pushed through. Rain masked the sting. His chest pressed into earth on the other side, soaked and shaking. Behind him, the camp remained lit in pulses, searchlights swinging like panicked eyes. But no shout came, no siren, no bullet. Emil ran. No one followed. And as the trees swallowed him whole, he didn't feel free, only afraid. The kind of fear that doesn't end when the danger passes. The kind that grows when you realize you've survived something no one was meant to survive. And that survival, itself, comes with a cost. When the war ended, the world staggered toward light like a wounded animal crawling out of a pit. Cities smoldered, flags were raised, families reunited in breathless disbelief. Names were spoken again, names thought buried in the smoke of crematoria and the ash of blitzed homes. But not Emil Weiss. His name was never called out in any village square. It didn't appear in the repatriation rosters shuffled between Allied forces, or in the fragile ledgers held together by tape and trauma in Red Cross stations. He had survived the camps. He had crossed the fence and vanished into the forest. And then, as the world began to count its dead and cling to its living, Emil did something few could understand. He disappeared. No official witnessed his liberation. No American patrol logged him as found. He did not board the trucks packed with ragged survivors or queue for the soup lines in the temporary camps the Allies erected in the ruins. There were no papers filed, no refugee ID issued. When liberation came, Emil was already gone, and no one noticed. In a world obsessed with documentation, this absence was unnatural. Men who had barely survived weeks in hiding emerged to reclaim their histories. Women who had lost everything stood in front of war crimes tribunals to testify, if only to ensure someone would remember. But Emil chose silence. He walked away from the ashes without looking back, without asking to be counted. Why? Perhaps freedom felt counterfeit. For so long, survival had been about evasion, about shrinking into corners and pretending not to exist. When the gates fell and uniforms changed, what truly shifted for someone who had learned to trust no one? The world that existed before the war had died with it, and Emil, scarred, silent, and hollow, had no place in the one being rebuilt. In the weeks following his escape, there are faint traces. A loaf of bread stolen from a monastery window. A man seen limping along a railway line in Austria, eyes too sunken to speak, then nothing. No border crossings. No requests for aid, just a hush. There were rumors, years later, of a man who refused to speak, who lived in a shack outside a Czech village and only came into town at dusk. Children whispered that he had no tongue, that he was cursed. The old said he was a soldier who had seen something so terrible it had split his soul. But no one knew his name. And no one asked. For many, freedom brought closure. Emil found only distance. Perhaps the silence was his way of mourning. Perhaps it was penance. Or perhaps he feared being pulled back into a world that had already devoured him once. To exist again, as Emil Weiss, might have meant confronting not only what had been done to him, but what he had done to stay alive. Survivors carried different burdens. Some spoke of justice, others of mercy. But for those who vanished, the absence itself became the story. A quiet refusal to be folded neatly into the narrative of liberation. He had walked through hell and come out the other side. But instead of standing in the sun, Emil stepped deeper into the woods. And in doing so, he ensured that no one could tell his story until someone found the suitcase. Until someone remembered. The journal was smaller than expected, leather-bound, no more than 100 pages. The cover blackened at the corners as if it had once been too close to fire. Its pages had warped with time and damp, some fused together, others torn at the edges. And yet, what remained inside was a haunting archive of a man trying to hold on to himself in a world that had forgotten his name. When the team of historians and forensic archivists first opened it, gloves on, breath held, they expected lists, dates, something orderly. But Emil Weiss had not been a man of order. His words came scattered, fractured, layered in ink and erasure, written in two tongues, German and Yiddish, blurring between one and the other like flickers of light through fog. There were no dates. Time moved like memory, inconsistent, often looping. One page held a sketch of a hand, bones visible beneath stretched skin, a number tattooed across the knuckles. On the opposite page, a poem, a single stanza repeated 3 times, each in a different language, as if Emil wasn't sure which would outlast the others. Another entry read simply, "They gave me back my life. I didn't want it." Elsewhere, amid lines of coordinates and crude map markings, he wrote of landscapes no one could identify, valleys with names that no longer existed, ruins that predated ruin. And then, the phrase. It first appeared halfway through the journal, scribbled in the margin next to a drawing of what looked like a monastery perched high in the Alps. The second silence is chosen. The ink was darker there, fresher, as though he had returned to the page years later. It reappeared again, later, beneath a sketch of a railway bridge shattered by explosives. The second silence is chosen. And again, in shaky block letters, beside what appeared to be a list of names, most of them crossed out. The repetition wasn't casual, it was a pulse, a mantra, or a warning. What did it mean? The historians debated. Some believed it was metaphor, a poetic way to describe the trauma Emil could not voice. The first silence was forced upon him in the camps. The second, he chose. Others wondered if it was a cipher, that each repetition came with a different context, suggesting a layered message. The cartographers examined his coordinates. One set led to a ravine in Austria, another to the outskirts of Prague. Places tied to nothing in official records, but still steeped in post-war secrets. But there was another theory, one that no one wanted to voice too loudly. That Emil had not disappeared out of fear, but out of purpose. That his silence was not escape, but act. That he had seen things after the war, done things, that demanded secrecy not for his protection, but for others. The journal was not a confession, not in the traditional sense. It was a ledger of reckoning, composed by a man who no longer believed in forgiveness. The last pages were almost illegible. Water damage, perhaps, or trembling hands. But on the final sheet, the ink held steady, as though he'd poured everything left into those few words. No sketches. No coordinates. Just the phrase, centered in the middle of the page. The second silence is chosen. It is the only freedom I have left. They closed the journal slowly, the room heavy with stillness. Emil had not written it for anyone to find, and yet he had not destroyed it. Somewhere between confession and disappearance, he left behind a single thread. Not to be pulled, but to be felt. A whisper buried beneath history, still echoing after 70 years. The monastery clung to the side of the mountain like a scar built of stone darker than the clouds that curled around its bell tower. It had no website, no welcome signs, no tour hours. The kind of place you didn't find unless you were meant to. Nestled deep in the Austrian Alps, it was reachable only by a narrow, winding path, and the kind of stubborn resolve that belonged more to pilgrims than to scholars. But the researchers had followed Emil's trail, decoding the notations in his journal, piecing together fragmented sketches and coordinates until the landscape he had drawn by memory matched this place. The final clue, a sketch of a crucifix above a pine ridge, nearly identical to the one that crowned the monastery's chapel. And so they climbed. Inside, time slowed. The air smelled of wood smoke and old parchment. Candles burned low in their holders. Footsteps whispered across the cold stone floor. The brothers here lived in near silence, their prayers murmured, their meals taken without words. They welcomed the outsiders with caution, suspicion hidden behind polite smiles. Historians were not uncommon in this part of the world, but they rarely came looking for one man. And certainly not a man who had arrived in the spring of 1946, wounded, rail-thin, and nameless. The monastery's ledgers were immaculate, handwritten in Latin, updated each season. In them, the researchers found the name Elias, no surname, simply Brother Elias. He had joined not long after the war ended, accepted under the monastery's vow of hospitality. No questions had been asked. He had offered no story, only silence. He took the cloth within a year. And then, he stayed. For 43 years. The monks remembered him differently. Some recalled a quiet kindness, the way he repaired shoes with unusual skill, the way he wandered into the mountains alone each winter to collect herbs that no one else could ever seem to find. Others described a restlessness beneath the surface, a man who flinched at loud noises, who never made eye contact for too long. They said he prayed more than most, that he wept, sometimes, during Mass, silently, his hands trembling. But never did he speak of his past. Not once. In the back of the monastery's library, one of the researchers found a small wooden box tucked behind a false panel. Inside, yellowed papers. A single photograph of Emil younger than when he would have entered the monastery, but with the same unmistakable eyes. Next to it, a page of symbols and letters, ciphered, familiar. The same handwriting as the journal. Why had he hidden here? What had he feared so deeply that he chose a life without identity, without speech, without even the sound of his own name? Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps vengeance. Or maybe he had simply seen too much, carried too many ghosts, to live among the living. Here, in the cold arms of the mountains, no one asked. No one remembered. And that, perhaps, was what he needed most. But one detail lingered. In the monastery's registry, under Elias, someone years later had written a note in the margins. Small, almost missed. Ex silentio veritas. From silence, truth. It was the only time the monks ever amended his entry. As if, even among those devoted to stillness, they had felt the weight of the story they were never told. The roll of film was hidden beneath the journal, inside a false lining of the suitcase's lower compartment, sealed with care, wrapped in oilcloth, tucked away as if its very existence was dangerous. The researchers hadn't noticed it at first. It took a second inspection, a quiet rattle when the suitcase was moved, a barely perceptible shift in the leather's weight. When they found it, no one spoke. Film of that age rarely survived intact, and the likelihood of any image developing after decades was slim. Still, they proceeded with reverence. What emerged from the negatives would fracture the story they thought they were piecing together. There were 5 photographs in total. Most were unremarkable. A snow-draped clearing, a rusted railway sign, a pair of boots resting beside a campfire. But it was the 4th image that brought the room to stillness. 2 men, mid-handshake. One was unmistakably Emma Weiss, older than in the photograph from the monastery, perhaps early 50s, with the same hollowed cheeks and intense stare. The other was harder to believe. The man he faced was an SS officer. Uniform stripped of insignia. Yes, but his identity was not in question. Wilhelm Draeger, a mid-level commander in the Sicherheitsdienst. Known interrogator. Known butcher. The photo was dated, faint markings scratched on the film's edge by Emil himself. May 1952, 7 years after the war's end. Draeger, according to official records, had vanished in 1946, presumed dead or in hiding. Yet here he was, captured mid-smile, hand extended in camaraderie or perhaps calculation. The setting was a nondescript alpine backdrop, bare trees and low hills behind them. No witnesses, just the lens, and the silence it preserved. The 5th image was the final shock. Draeger again, but this time slumped in a wooden chair, eyes open, mouth parted. The background matched the previous photo. No blood, no sign of struggle. Just stillness. Death, clean and deliberate. The photo had no date. But Draeger's body would be discovered weeks later in a Swiss ravine, listed under a false name. Cause of death, unknown. Suspected heart failure. No one had ever connected it to Emil. Until now. The implications were immediate and murky. Had Emil tracked him down? Had the handshake been a cover, a prelude to retribution? Or had it meant something else entirely? The researchers debated furiously. Some argued that Emil had gone rogue, joining the ranks of quiet vengeance takers who hunted Nazis across Europe when justice proved slow or blind. Others speculated the opposite, that he had infiltrated Draeger's network to gather information, or perhaps to confront a past tethered to him more intimately than records could ever reveal. But the most haunting theory was also the most human. That Emil had not intended to kill at all. That he had sought out Draeger not out of rage, but for closure. To understand. To speak if only once before retreating again into silence. And what happened between those 2 photos would remain forever obscured. Why would he preserve the evidence? Why not destroy the film, erase the memory? Perhaps Emil knew that history, like wounds, must sometimes be reopened to heal. Or perhaps he simply couldn't let it vanish without proof that it had ever happened. The photograph had no caption, no explanation. Just two men locked in a moment, survivor and executioner, handshake or trap, forgiveness or farewell. And behind the frozen image, a question that echoed louder than any answer. What does justice look like when spoken by those who cannot speak? The last entries in the journal were unlike the others. Gone were the sketches, the cryptic coordinates, the jagged poetry scribbled across the margins. These final pages were deliberate, clearer, more focused, as though Emil had finally surrendered to the need for clarity after years of evasion. The ink was darker, the script steadier. And over, in the spaces between sentences, a phrase returned like a refrain. A debt to be buried. At first, the words appeared in passing. Then, they became a title. Finally, they stood alone, centered on the page, underlined once. It was as though Emil had not written it for memory's sake, but as a confession only he could understand. A few pages later, the tone shifted. There was mention of a name obscured, partially erased, but enough letters remained for researchers to reconstruct it. Victor Hallstein, a former logistics officer in the SS, believed to have orchestrated the movement of thousands to death camps in Poland. Official records showed that Hallstein had vanished in 1945 and remained hidden until his dramatic capture in a small town near Bremen in the winter of 1963. He had been living under a false identity, running a shipping company, quietly rebuilding his life as the world tried to forget what he had helped to destroy. What few people knew was that Hallstein's arrest had come from an anonymous tip. No witnesses, no details. Just a letter, typed, postmarked in Salzburg, listing Hallstein's address, his movements, his aliases. German police had received it in early November. By December, Hallstein was in custody, and the sender was never identified. That same month, a man matching Emil Weiss's age and description was seen briefly in a local cafe in Salzburg, hunched over a cup of coffee he never touched. The barista remembered his silence, the way he stared at the rain outside the window as if waiting for something to be washed away. The man paid an exact change. No name, no conversation. He left behind a napkin with a single sentence written in careful German. Redemption is not return, it is absence made deliberate. After that, the trail went cold again. Was Emil responsible for the tip that led to Hallstein's arrest? The timing, the journal entries, and the geographic link were impossible to ignore. Yet nothing in the official record tied him directly. No fingerprint, no statement. Just a chain of clues that seemed designed not to prove, but to whisper. Some believe Emil had taken it upon himself to find those who escaped justice, not for vengeance, but as a way of reclaiming the fragments of himself that had been lost in the camps. That his silence was not withdrawal but focus. That each disappearance was not retreat but completion. Others argue it was guilt. That Emil had survived by luck or by doing things no man would want remembered, and that by exposing those who had orchestrated the machinery of death, he sought to balance scales that could never truly be evened. That his own survival had cost others their lives, and this was the only way he knew to repay the debt. The final words of the journal were written in Yiddish, almost childlike in their simplicity. I have not returned. I have only stopped running. Beneath them, smudged by what may have been a drop of water or a tear, was a crude drawing of a river winding through hills, ashes drifting along the current. No name signed, no date given. Just a sense of finality, like a curtain pulled over a stage no one realized had been set. Whatever he was chasing, revenge, redemption, or the ghost of who he once was, Emil Weiss had buried it, not in the ground, but in silence. And, perhaps, in the river. The letter was hidden, not between pages, but within them, pressed deep inside the spine of the journal, glued between layers of aging paper and leather. It was found by accident, during conservation efforts to preserve the brittle binding, the conservator noticed an unnatural bulge, a tightness where the journal should have bent easily. With careful precision, they peeled back the inner lining, revealing a small folded page, yellowed but intact. It was addressed, simply, to A, no surname, no date. Just a single initial, written with unmistakable tenderness. The letter's contents would change the entire narrative. It began with an apology. "Forgive me for not saying goodbye," Emile wrote. "Forgive me for surviving, and for what I've chosen to become." The lines that followed were unlike anything else found in the journal, soft, lyrical, aching with a kind of love that had not been allowed to live. Emile wrote of a woman in Prague, a seamstress with kind hands and fierce eyes. He did not name her, but described a moment. The sound of rain on a tin roof, her laughter echoing down a narrow alley, the way she folded her letters into swans. They had met, it seemed, in the aftermath sometime in the late 1942. Both were trying to rebuild lives from ashes, both cloaked in the quiet grief of those who had lost too much. Emile had not told her everything. Perhaps he couldn't. Perhaps he feared what the truth might steal from them. But what he did say in the letter was clear. She was pregnant. "I chose silence," he wrote. "Not because I didn't want to be found, but because I wanted you to be free. I will disappear so you can live not as the daughter of a fugitive or a ghost, but as someone untethered by the weight I carry." It was the clearest declaration of intent in everything Emile had ever left behind. Not revenge, not penance, but protection. His absence had not been cowardice. It had been love, sharpened into something selfless. The letter had been written in Czech, folded tightly into itself, and sealed with a pressed wax mark barely visible now. Alongside it was a small slip of cloth, frayed at the edges, the corner of what looked like a baby's bonnet. Modern forensic researchers ran a DNA analysis on the edge of that cloth, hoping against odds that it might yield something. Weeks later, they had a match. A woman in her 70s, living in Brno. Anna Wasova. A retired librarian with no knowledge of her father's identity. Her mother, long since passed, had always said he died before Anna was born. When contacted, Anna wept without understanding why. She had always felt there was something missing, some story left half-told in the way her mother looked at old photographs or went silent in certain months of the year. Now she knew. She had lived a full life, as Emile had wanted. Free from the stain of history, free from the shadow of war. But she had also lived unaware of the depth of that gift. The price her father paid was solitude, erasure, a name buried in the corners of old maps and forgotten rooms. She keeps the letter now, in a glass case by her bedside. Reads it every night, not for answers, but for presence. Proof that love, even when silent, leaves echoes. Proof that some disappearances are not losses, but acts of devotion. History, as we are taught it, is a sequence of certainties, dates, wars, names etched into stone or stored in archives, repeated until they form the scaffolding of collective memory. But beneath that structure lies another history, quieter, more fragile, one built from things deliberately left unsaid. Emile Weiss lived in that silence, not as a footnote, but as a ghost threading the seams between the remembered and the forgotten. When his suitcase was discovered in that attic in France, it didn't scream for attention. It did not announce itself as a revelation. It waited, patiently, as though knowing that the world would only listen when it was ready to understand. Inside it were not proclamations, not victories or grand testimonies, but remnants. Sketches, broken sentences, coordinates, blurred photographs. Pieces of a life lived at the edge of visibility. A puzzle missing corners that could never be recovered, but still spoke. Emile was not a hero in the traditional sense. He saved no battalions, liberated no camps, led no movements. Nor was he a villain. He did not seek glory, nor retribution in the way the world would recognize. He was a man scarred so deeply that the only way forward was to disappear again and again until the lines between identity and myth blurred into something untraceable. And perhaps that was his intention: to vanish without applause, without burdening others with the weight he carried. But silence is never empty. It holds shape, it holds meaning. And Émile's silence, once deciphered, has become a mirror. One that reflects back the pieces of history we've been too comfortable overlooking. The idea that survival is clean, that justice is loud, that healing is linear. Émile challenges all of that. His story refuses the binary of good and evil, of villain and victim. It insists on complexity, on nuance, on the deeply human truth that sometimes the most extraordinary acts happen in the shadows. We now know he lived for decades as Brother Elias, not preaching, not leading, but listening. We know he tracked at least one war criminal and may have helped bring others to justice, not with fanfare, but through quiet intervention. We know he loved deeply and chose absence to protect the one person who might have tied him to a past he was trying to outrun. And we know, ultimately, that he never truly vanished. His story simply waited until someone cared enough to find it. Émile Weiss did not rewrite history in the way textbooks might acknowledge. He did not shift the outcome of the war. But he rewrote what we thought we knew about the aftermath, about what it means to survive, to carry guilt, to live with the unbearable knowledge of what others did and what you had to do. He showed us that some stories are not meant to be shouted from podiums. They are meant to be unearthed gently, held with trembling hands, and understood not as revelations, but as reckonings. There is no statue to Émile, no memorial plaque, just a letter, a photograph, a journal, a daughter who now understands her silence was inherited. A suitcase tucked away in an archive, its contents still whispering to those willing to listen. History is not only what we remember, it is also what we choose to forget. And sometimes, the forgotten are the ones who tell us the most.